and welcome to today's lecture on the ancient city of Thebes. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we'll continue our site-based exploration of one of the most important political and religious sites in the entirety of New Kingdom Egypt. The city of Thebes was consistently a hotbed of revolt, both in the first and in the second intermediate periods. And both times, those revolts were successful. As a result of all their military success, the leaders of Thebes built massive temples to honor the gods that they believed led them to such victories. And those temples, from Karnak to Luxor to Medinet Habu, serve as some of the greatest monuments in all of Egyptian history. So whether you're interested in building something that will last, well, will last 1,000 lifetimes. Journey with me as we investigate Thebes, the city of Amun.
The city of Thebes was the most powerful, important, and religious city in all of New Kingdom Egypt. Now, if the name Thebes sounds a little bit more Greek than Egyptian, there actually is a Thebes in Greece as well. You'd be absolutely right. The Greeks called the city Thebes based on the name of the nearby temple of Karnak, Ta Opet, which I guess to the Greeks kind of sounded like Thebes. In Egyptian, it was also known as Waset, the southern city, and as Pa-Amun, the abode of Amun. So keep in mind when we use our English words for ancient Egyptian sites, it's often based on how the ancient Greeks thought those sites sounded, kind of a Hellenization or a Greekization of ancient Egyptian names for their own cities.
Thebes is located in the south, in Upper Egypt, right in the middle of the bend in the Nile River. There's not much to see of the actual ancient city anymore, where regular people lived and where mighty rulers ruled, because it sits under the modern Egyptian town of Luxor. Oh, not that Luxor. There, that Luxor. What we do have, however, are the substantial remains of the religious and funerary monuments constructed by the kings of Egypt during the Middle and New Kingdoms.
The origin of Thebes dates back to the First Intermediate Period. During this time, the nomarchs of Thebes grew in power, eventually becoming strong enough to challenge, and eventually overthrow, the rival Heracleopolitan kings, and then establish the Middle Kingdom. 500 years later, the Theban nomarchs again challenged the ruling party, this time the Hyksos kings, ruling from Avaris in the Delta. And once again, the Thebans eventually won the day.
After the Thebans defeated the Hyksos, the 18th dynasty made Thebes its political capital. And to thank the gods for their good fortune in war, they began a massive building program with religious architecture and the glorification of the king at its center. But gone were the days of giant pyramids as tombs. Now were the times of massive temples, to Amun at sites like Karnak and Luxor, and enormous temples to pharaohs at sites like Medinet Habu.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of specific temples, it's useful to know the basic ideology and physical layout of an Egyptian temple. There were a wide variety of temples, but all of them, more or less, served the same purpose. They were the home of the gods, of the divine spirits, and they were places where rituals could be performed to keep the gods and spirits happy, healthy, and out of danger.
In ancient Egypt, one of the most important ideological concepts was that of Ma'at, or the divine truth and order. According to ancient Egyptian beliefs, Ma'at was always doing battle with Isfet, the divine concept of chaos or evil. And much of ancient Egyptian religion, and the practice and rituals and temples, comes back to this idea of preserving Ma'at and keeping Isfet at bay.
At its core, an Egyptian temple was the home of the god. The sanctuary begins with a temenos, which is a Greek word for an external wall that marks off the sacred space inside from the profane space outside. The space gets more sacred the deeper you get into the temple, so visitors may have been able to enter the first courtyard on holy days, but only priests were allowed any further. Upon entering the complex, you'd see what looks like a massive defensive wall. This is known as a pylon, and it's the monumental entrance to the temple. The shape of the pylon, the slanting sides and the depression in the middle, is meant to mimic the sun rising from behind the horizon. Once through the pylon, you'd enter a series of open courtyards and closed hypostyle halls. Hypostyle halls are filled with columns, often in the shape of papyrus reeds or palm trees, and light is restricted the deeper you get into the temple. Often a second deeper, darker hall would follow after the main hypostyle hall. This area was even more restrictive.
At the back, along the same axis as the pylon, the courtyards, and the hypostyle hall, is the sacred shrine where the cult statue of the god existed. This cult statue would need to be treated just like a person. It needed to be clothed, it needed to be fed, and provided with offerings and worshipped with incense. All sorts of rituals to keep the god happy. To facilitate this, there was often a sacred pool or pond or lake, whose water would be used in the rituals to purify and please the gods.
Perhaps the most famous temple in all of Egypt is the Temple of Karnak, located in the northeastern part of the ancient city of Thebes. The Temple of Amun at Karnak is the largest religious structure in the world. It covers over 200 acres, and 3 cathedrals of Notre Dame could fit within the footprint of the temple. This thing is absolutely huge.
So how did it get so big? Well, it was built over the course of more than 1,000 years. Construction began during the Middle Kingdom. But the earliest precincts in the temple aren't to Amun, but rather to Mut and Mentu. And this makes sense considering that Mentuhotep II was the first king of the Middle Kingdom. The largest part of the temple, the precinct of Amun-Ra, was primarily built during the New Kingdom. Each pharaoh would add to and embellish the temple with their own additions, and something like 30 different pharaohs contributed to this temple overall. So that's how you build the biggest, baddest, best religious structure ever created.
The most striking feature of the Temple of Amun at Karnak is its massive, sprawling hypostyle hall. This consisted of 134 enormous sandstone columns, shaped like lotus, palm, and papyrus plants. You can even notice how the center ones have their leaves spread, while the side columns have not yet blossomed. These columns were all ornately carved with biographical stories of the New Kingdom kings who constructed it, with images of the gods, and with scenes of the ritual ensuring the gods were taken care of, even if people weren't around.
Now, one way to think about New Kingdom temples is as a recreation of the cosmos. We've already mentioned that the pylon symbolizes the sun rising over the horizon, and the ground itself slopes upwards as you get deeper, symbolizing the primordial mound from which all life arose. The roof of the temple was covered with stars, symbolizing the heavens, and the columns represent plants that arose out of the earliest marshes during creation as the floodwaters subsided. And this effect would be magnified during the flood season, when the outer areas of the temple would have actually become inundated. Pretty cool recreation of the cosmos.
Karnak wasn't the only temple at Thebes, though. Just south and west of Karnak sits the Temple of Luxor. Usually when we talk about the Temple of Luxor, we're talking about a temple built primarily by Amenhotep III and Ramses II, and one that was dedicated to Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, a group of divinities known as the Theban Triad. In antiquity, the grand avenue of sphinxes, mythical creatures with human heads and the body of a lion, would have linked Karnak and Luxor temples, crossing the city of Thebes. Today, you can still see the southernmost of the Avenue of the Sphinxes leading to the outer pylon of the Luxor temple. The outer pylon itself was built by the mighty Ramses II and records his quote-unquote victory over the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh.
Once inside, you enter the great courtyard of Ramses II, surrounded by lotus leaf capitals. And we can start to see here how these temples get built in layers. So there's a shrine in the northwest corner that was built generations earlier by Hatshepsut. And as one makes their way through the courtyard, they get to the colonnade of Amenhotep III, filled with papyrus columns. The great courtyard of Amenhotep III and his impressive hypostyle hall follow in order.
Behind the hypostyle hall are a series of sanctuaries. You get the cult sanctuary of Amun, which was stuccoed and painted over more than 1,000 years later by the Romans. And you get the bark shrine of Amun that was redone by Alexander the Great, who depicts himself, a Greek guy, as the Pharaoh of Egypt. To the east you get the birth room, showing the divine birth of Amenhotep III, and the deepest sanctuary of Amenhotep III still has the statue base on which the cult statue stood.
This isn't just dead architecture though. Ancient Thebes was an active site and the center of the Opet festival. During this annual festival, the statues of the Theban Triad, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, were taken out of the temple at Karnak and paraded down to the temple of Luxor. Once the Karnak statue of Amun got to Luxor, it would meet its counterpart statue inside the Luxor temple. Celebration ensued, and the king of Egypt was re-coronated during this awesome party.
So far, we've looked at temples dedicated to the gods. But as the political center of the 18th dynasty, Thebes was also flush with temples dedicated to the pharaohs themselves. This requires a little background to make sense of. Back in the Old Kingdom, kings would build themselves a mortuary temple adjacent to their pyramid. This would be the place where rituals would sustain the spirit of the deceased king, and where that spirit could move between the afterlife and the world of the living. But by the New Kingdom, the pharaohs had discarded the idea of the pyramids, opting for hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And as a result, their mortuary temples could be placed anywhere, since you no longer wanted those temples giving away the location of the tomb.
These mortuary temples became incredibly impressive during the New Kingdom. Because of their association with death, they were usually placed on the west side of the Nile River, the side of the setting sun. We can see with Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri in the western desert of Thebes, a great example of the grandeur that these temples could exhibit. Its 3 terraces heading straight into the dramatic cliffs above.
As the New Kingdom progressed, the mortuary temples of the kings became more detached from their tombs, and eventually adopted the form of traditional temples at sites like Karnak and Luxor. The Temple of Ramses II, known as the Ramesseum, was built during the 13th century BCE, and it exhibits the classic pylon, courtyard, hypostyle hall, and sanctuary structure as the temples across the river. Ramses' victories over the Hittite forces at the Battle of Kadesh are recorded on the pylons that front this temple.
About a mile southwest of the Ramesseum is the mortuary temple of Ramses III. And once again, we see the classic pylon, courtyard, hypostyle hall, sanctuary layout common of New Kingdom temples to the gods. And once again, we get the imagery of military, quote-unquote, victories on the pylons. Most famously, we see the depiction of Ramses III defeating the Sea Peoples, the group of naval marauders that attacked Egypt in the early 12th century BCE, and who are often seen as the cause of the widespread destruction across the Mediterranean and the Near East, perhaps causing the collapse of the Bronze Age. Fun fact here though, even though Ramses II shows himself defeating the Hittites and Ramses III shows himself defeating the Sea Peoples, it's actually debatable whether either of them actually won either of those battles. The treaty after the Battle of Kadesh suggests otherwise, and even if Ramses III did push the Sea Peoples back, Egypt quickly fell into a period of fragmentation during the Third Intermediate Period, shortly after the invasion of the Sea Peoples. I guess don't believe everything the pharaoh tells you. The city of Thebes played a critical role in New Kingdom Egypt, not just because it was the seat of political power, but because the money and resources the pharaohs put into the temples made it a source of religious power as well. Now this was in part because kings thought of themselves as pious. But this was also another way for the king to solidify power for himself, to stress the king's unique relationship to the gods, and to demonstrate the health and wealth of the Egyptian empire. This culminated in later New Kingdom pharaohs building temples to themselves that looked just like the temples to Amun and the Theban Triad. So if you want to solidify power, it's not just about you, it's about who you're close to, especially if that's the gods. Just a couple lessons you can learn from Thebes, the city of Amun.